Astonishingly, only few Shakespeare admirers and experts are aware of the fact that there exist two different versions of the play, lying almost 30 years apart. A. The Taming of A Shrew, an anonymous version, printed in 1594, within the first year of Marlowe's disappearance. B. The Taming of THE Shrew, the Shakespeare First Folio version, printed in 1623. Although the anonymous play The Taming of A Shrew shares its background story, its subplot, or its prologue, with Shakespeare's The Taming of THE Shrew, the majority of the orthodox experts, so-called Stratfordians, to this day, grotesquely continue to postulate that the authors of both plays had nothing to do with each other. Both prologues offer an astonishing number of clues to Christopher Marlowe's surviving after the Deptford event on May 30, 1593. This was elaborated by Isabel Gauthier in The Clue in the Shrew, a tumbling trick. For Isabel Gauthier, the official version of Marlowe's murder in Deptford was improbable in the extreme. For her it looked as if the Deptford episode was a farce, presented as such in the induction or the prologue of both plays. Gauthier came to the most plausible conclusion, that Marlowe must have been the author of both prologues, as well as of the plays. A. That allegorically he disclosed highly relevant autobiographical information in the text of the prologues, confessing. B. That he did not die in Deptford, on May 30 in 1593, but that he was helped to escape by a lord and his servants. C. That he was the poet genius, who wrote the entire canon of Shakespeare's plays. Gauthier saw the text of both prologues as a deliberate parable, or simile of Marlowe, unveiling autobiographically his own fatal destiny, as Christopher Sly. Gauthier was aware that the prologue in The Taming of the Shrew had the foremost purpose to allegorically disclose the author's real destiny. In brief, a man called Christopher Sly, a tinker, after a brawl with the tavern hostess over the bill, is left looking murdered in the street. A lord that is passing by, with his servants, having checked that Christopher is not dead, has taken him to his house, where Sly is fed and clothed and offered to watch a comedy. While this comedy is taking place, Christopher Sly silently disappears, and, parallel to the true Shakespeare's life situation, nothing is ever heard of him again. Gauthier early noticed not only the strange coincidence in the first name, Christopher, and the surname or family name, Sly, and the early final disappearance of Christopher, but she also detected highly significant clues that systematically matched the thesis that the prologue represents a parable of Marlowe's fate. Most of those clues are rather convincing, more than each clue taken singly. However, it is the cumulative effect of all of them which seem overwhelming. Both Shrew plays contain the prologue induction, a play outside the play, totally independent from the main play, relating the dream of Sly or beggar's tale. According to Isabel Gauthier, the origin of the beggar's tale goes back to Goulet's Stresa di Historias Admirables et Memorables, which was translated into English by Edward Grimston, in 1607. Thus, whoever was the anonymous author of The Taming of a Shrew, within the year 1594, of Marlowe's sudden disappearance, he would have had to read this tale in the original French. Easy imaginable for Marlowe, but by no means for Shakespeare. Beyond any reasonable doubt. The Taming of a Shrew, and The Taming of the Shrew, can only have been written by the same author. It seems highly conspicuous that the prologue was rewritten, in the First Folio in 1623, in such a way as to be almost 3 times longer than the prologue in 1594. No other than Marlowe, still alive in 1623, could have modified the late Folio Shrew version of the prologue. Note, the lines corresponding to the original final scene and intermediate dialogues in 1594, in the Shakespeare Folio version are chopped off, leaving Sly nowhere and losing its moralizing justification. A point noteworthy in The Taming of a Shrew is the surprising number of text parallels, elaborated by Richard Proudfoot, to be drawn from various Marlowe's plays. Specifically from Tamburlaine, Parts 1 and 2, Dr. Faustus, Edward II, as well as from Shakespeare's Henry VI. Proudfoot pointed out that the anonymous writer of The Taming of a Shrew was drawing his inspiration, other than from himself, almost exclusively from Marlowe. Proudfoot, since the first known printed edition of Dr. Faustus dates from 1604, the compiler of The Taming of a Shrew must have had access to performances or manuscripts of the play. Let's read, compare and reflect a few examples. The stunning examples of Marlowe's text parallels between The Taming of a Shrew and Marlowe's plays are more than absolutely sufficient to prove, once and for all, that the anonymous author of the early Shrew play could possibly only have been Christopher Marlowe, who still was alive, undoubtedly hiding behind one of his most famous pseudonyms, Shakespeare. but there are other pen names such as Thomas Middleton and Thomas Dekker, as experts, like Professor Gary Taylor, found out to be the anonymous co-authors of A. Shrew. Unfortunately, those experts were unable to derive more rational conclusions from more logical arguments. It seems totally irrational to assume that a poet genius Marlowe would have taken the trouble to plagiarize numerous quotations of his own plays from an anonymous author of The Taming of A Shrew in 1594, instead from himself. Let us consider a few samples of evidences in the very beginning of the prologue of Shakespeare's The Shrew, to illustrate the tremendous extent to which the true Shakespeare was able to condense an amount of information in any of his lines. Literally every word in almost all lines has an additional, second or third meaning that cannot be grasped straight away. In the very beginning of the prologue, the beggar, Christopher Sly, reveals his intentions. "I will fees you in faith." To fees is an unusual verb and, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, means here, "I will unravel the thread." To fees, to unravel a rope, since the expression to fees is the only one that appears in the late version, it means, "I will make my situation known to you." There must have been serious reasons for the fact that the tapster of the early version in 1594, in the late folio version, 1623, was converted into a hostess. The coroner's report, discovered as late as 1925, states that the alleged killing of Marlowe took place in a house of the hostess, Eleanor Bull, with family ties, later recognized, to William Cecil. Be aware, a hostess amazingly is also introduced at the end of the late version of Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, B version from 1616. Christopher Sly is outraged at his treatment by the hostess and brags that the Slys are not villains, ye are a baggage, the Slys are no rogues. He asks those present to read about him in the chronicles. They came with Richard the Conqueror, with which he would like to point out his lineage and upbringing. Look in the chronicles, we came in with Richard Conqueror. Isabel Gortizar assumes that this is a reference to William the Conqueror in Richard III, which was about a rivalry between Burbage and Shakespeare. Since there are 3 historical Richards, but only one Conqueror, the name William could have been left out, to show that we hadn't have, ambiguously, nothing to do with William the Conqueror, with Shakespeare. For Isabel Gortizar, however, the most important clue is Christopher Sly's invitation to read about him in the Annals or Chronicles. In the second volume of Grafton's Chronicle at Large, Morley is listed as one of the gentlemen that came in with William Conqueror, and on page 4 of the third volume of Holinshet's Chronicles, 1586, appears a More Lion Mane in the role of Batalabi, which is followed by a catalogue of such noblemen, lords, and gentlemen of name, as came into this land with William the Conqueror. It could well be that the Shakespeares came with Richard the Conqueror, and the Morleys with William the Conqueror. In the early version, the tapster throws Don Cristo on the street, because he is drunk and vomits. In the late version the reason is different. There is a dispute over the payment. You will not pay for the glasses you have burst. Note, it is well known, the reason for Marlowe's supposed death in Deptford was a banal dispute over a bill in the house of the hostess Eleanor Bull. two references to Thomas Kyd's Spanish tragedy can already be recognized in the first lines. On the one hand, the words pocas palabras instead of Kyd's correct Spanish expression, pocas palabras, as an invitation to secrecy. On the other hand, the words, go by, Saint Geronimi, go to thy cold bed. This expression in Kyd's Spanish tragedy was, Hieronimo beware, go by, go by. Hieronimo is mentioned here, who advised to be careful when planning the revenge. These closely interrelated references to the late Thomas Kyd, both in the first lines of the introduction, in which Sly advises secrecy, reveal the author's specific intention to introduce Thomas Kyd as one of the contributors to Marlowe's tragic and fateful situation. As is known, in the month of Marlowe's official death, May 1593, the Privy Council commissioned the search for the authors of the Dutch libel, signed Tambureln, who threatened to undermine public order in London. Writings and documents were found when Thomas Kyd's rooms were searched. Kyd admitted under torture on the rack that the documents belonged to Marlowe, with whom he had written for a while in a room. Christopher Sly, Marlowe seems to say that because he no longer exists, he can no longer be avenged. With which he seems to appease his old friend Kyd, whose death, go to thy cold bed, made him feel guilty. Kyd died in July 1594, probably as a result of his inquisitive ordeals. In line 10, the hostess threatens to call the local authority, the third borough, and Christopher replies with a wordplay. I'll answer him by law, I'll not budge an inch. In reality, someone else's dead body was left behind and identified, who could not move an inch. At this point, the scene instruction says, Christopher Sly falls asleep, while the Lord appears with his hunting entourage. It is the moment in the parable of Christopher's allegorical demise when he dives and falls asleep for decades. There is not enough room to go through all the stunning double meanings of virtually the whole prologue text, and thus learn more about the background of the author's destiny. Let's regard a few more unrecognized, allegoric allusions and insights about the real Shakespeare, derived from the prologue. In the prologue of Shakespeare's The Taming of the Shrew, the Lord describes Christopher Sly allegorically as a mighty man, of such descent, of such possessions, of so high esteem. Whereas, in sharp contrast, Christopher Sly, the beggar, describes himself multifaceted allegorically as Old Sigh's son of Burton Heath, by birth a peddler, by education a card maker, by transmutation a bear herd, by profession a tinker. All those word games are of some significance in John Foxe's Book of Martyrs, Old Sigh's son of Burton Heath. One gets the impression that Marlowe wanted to inform his contemporaries about his own fate, seeing himself as a martyr, by synchronizing his thoughts with passages in John Foxe's contemporary book. It must have a meaning that Christopher Sly allegorically identifies himself with very different attributes: his job description, A tinker means, according to OED, a wandering stromer. Indeed, this may have been a description that Marlowe gave himself, a homeless, hidden, wandering poet, a playwright, an agent, an ambassador etc., analogous to the tinker, Autolycus, in Shakespeare's The Winter's Tale. Previously, he had become a bear keeper, by transmutation a bear herd. It is conceivable that Marlowe described this bear keeper's metaphor, when one recalls that the leading actor in Marlowe's most famous play, Tamburlaine, Edward Allen, spoke wild monologues, by whom he was called the bear biter, or the master of the bears became known, and Marlowe was, so to speak, the literary guardian of the herd of actors. Through education, he became a card maker, says Sly. In Fox's list of martyrs there is a Franciscan monk, named John Cardmaker, who was burned on the same day as Marlowe, May 30, 38 years earlier, because of heresy on the orders of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Cardmaker had tried to escape in 1554, but it was captured and brought to the Star Chamber on November 4, 1554. It cannot be a coincidence that the poet chose the name Cardmaker without thinking. The year of Cardmaker's cremation in 1555 has been shown to burn more than 20 other people. Cardmaker not only shares the exact date and reason for Marlowe's own supposed death. His fate is also to be equated with Marlowe's made a dissident. The Lord expressing himself towards the noble Lord in an extraordinarily chosen and exaggeratedly flattering way, while the unfortunate Christopher does not seem to understand what is happening to him. The contrast between the Lord's artificial language and Christopher's insistence that he was not a rich noble is striking. Without the background of Christopher's parable, nobody could understand why a drunken beggar at the same time is a banished noble lord. Woken, let's sing 20 caged nightingales, his 20 speechless hidden poetical substitutes, like Philomel. Just listen.
O noble Lord, bethink thee of thy birth. Call home thy ancient thoughts from banishment, and banish hence these abject lowly dreams. Look, how thy servants do attend on thee, each in his office, ready at thy beck. Wilt thou hear music? Hark, Apollo plays, and 20 caged nightingales do sing. On wilt thou sleep? We will hie thee to a couch, softer and sweeter than the lustful bed, on purpose trimmed up for Semiramis.
At the end of the prologue, Christopher Sly is informed that a comedy will now being shown to him. Messenger. Therefore they thought it good, you hear a play, and frame your mind to mirth and merriment, which bears 1,000 harms, and lengthens life. Beggar. Marry, I will let them play. Is it not a comedy? A Christmas gambold? A tumbling trick? Lady. No, my good lord, it is more pleasing stuff. Beggar. What? Household stuff. Lady. It is a kind of history. Yes, indeed. It's a kind of history. Of an autobiographical history. The true Shakespeare, disguised as Christopher Sly, must have had the intention of bringing his personal situation closer to the audience, in a parable, mimicking the total confusion of the historical authorship situation and the author's real identity, a tumbling trick from his own life, with a pretended death, which in reality only was a sleep. The fact that the epilogue from the Taming of A Shrew in 1594, in the Taming of THE Shrew, in 1623, was deleted, indicates that at later times Marlowe gave up his hopes of ever returning from his sleep, that is, from his final disappearance and final loss of identity. Astonishingly, the main play, A Shrew in 1594, immediately begins with a remarkable phrase of Polydore. From Cestus, situated at the Hellespont, famous for the location of the tragedy of Hero and Leander, confessing that he cannot tell, as he would, when welcoming his friends. Be aware that in the same year, 1594, of the printing of A Shrew play, also Marlowe's poem Hero and Leander was registered, but not allowed to be printed before 1598.